The entrance to Maple Ridge Estates looked like the picture of the American dream. Carefully trimmed hedges lined every street. Decorative stone signs welcomed visitors with promises of elegance, security, and community pride. Fresh flowers bloomed around the clubhouse throughout every season. Every mailbox stood at exactly the same height. Every lawn appeared perfectly measured. Every driveway sparkled under the afternoon sun. To anyone passing through, it looked like the kind of neighborhood families dreamed about. But appearances had become the greatest weapon ever created inside Maple Ridge. Behind the polished streets lived a different reality. Residents whispered instead of speaking openly. Neighbors kept curtains closed whenever the HOA board gathered. Families who had once hosted block parties now avoided eye contact, afraid that one wrong conversation would lead to another violation, notice appearing on their front door. The Homeowners Association had once existed to maintain the neighborhood. Now it existed to control it. For nearly 12 years, the same HOA president had remained in power. Margaret Collins had mastered something far more dangerous than leadership. She had mastered fear. Every election somehow ended the same way. Every financial report became harder to understand. Every complaint disappeared before reaching a public meeting. Every question was answered with another rule, another fine, another threat. Those who challenged her found themselves receiving mysterious citations within days. A mailbox painted the wrong shade of white. A trash can left visible for 30 extra minutes. Grass supposedly 1 inch too tall. Holiday decorations removed 1 day too late. The violations multiplied until families either paid thousands of dollars or quietly sold their homes. Nobody could ever prove the citations were intentional. Nobody could ever prove the board members were targeting critics. But everyone noticed the pattern. The people who remained silent enjoyed peaceful lives. The people who asked questions became examples. Over time, silence became part of the neighborhood culture. Children learned not to ride bicycles near the clubhouse. Teenagers stopped playing basketball after receiving complaints about excessive noise. Retired couples avoided planting flowers unless first approved by the HOA Landscaping Committee. Maple Ridge no longer felt like home. It felt like property under constant inspection. Then, on an unusually warm spring afternoon, a moving truck rolled slowly through the entrance gates. Most neighbors peeked through their windows. New families always attracted attention, especially because newcomers hadn't yet learned the invisible rules. The truck stopped outside one of the oldest homes in the neighborhood. The house had remained empty for almost 8 months after its previous owners had suddenly moved away following endless disputes with the HOA. No one expected anyone to buy it. Yet someone had. The family looked ordinary. A father carrying heavy boxes. A mother organizing furniture. A teenage daughter carefully placing flower pots along the porch. An elderly grandmother smiling as she admired the large oak tree growing beside the driveway. Nothing about them suggested trouble. Their last name appeared on the mailbox by sunset. The Parkers. Within hours, several neighbors quietly welcomed them with homemade desserts and polite smiles. None of them stayed very long. Every conversation ended the same way. A forced smile. A quick goodbye. A nervous glance toward the clubhouse. Almost everyone wanted to warn the Parkers. Almost nobody had the courage. Only one elderly resident lingered longer than the others. Mr. Harold Bennett had lived in Maple Ridge since the neighborhood was built. He remembered when children played freely until sunset. He remembered community picnics. He remembered board meetings where disagreements ended with laughter instead of lawsuits. Age had made him slower, but it had also made him less afraid. As he walked back toward his home, he looked once more at the Parker family unpacking together. Hope briefly crossed his face. Hope quickly turned into concern. He had seen this story before. New families always believed rules existed to protect everyone equally. They eventually discovered the rules only protected those who enforced them. Across the street, another pair of eyes watched the moving truck. Margaret Collins stood behind perfectly polished living room curtains. She never introduced herself first. She preferred observing. Within minutes, she already noticed several things. The moving truck remained, parked slightly beyond the allowed curb limit. The grandmother placed ceramic pots that appeared larger than HOA guidelines permitted. The daughter leaned a bicycle against the porch railing. Minor details. Insignificant to normal people. Useful to Margaret. Power always began with small things. By evening, she had already instructed the compliance officer to conduct a routine inspection. Routine inspections somehow never happened when her closest friends violated neighborhood rules. They happened when she wanted someone reminded who controlled Maple Ridge. The next morning began peacefully for the Parker family. David Parker believed buying the house had been the fresh start they desperately needed. After years of saving, sacrificing vacations, and working overtime, they had finally afforded a neighborhood where their daughter could grow up safely. He admired the clean streets, the quiet mornings, the sense of order. He believed the HOA explained why everything looked so beautiful. He hadn't yet realized beauty, maintained through intimidation, eventually stopped being beautiful. His wife, Emily, spent the morning planting roses along the front walkway. Gardening had always helped her feel settled. Their daughter, Olivia, explored nearby walking trails with excitement. Even their grandmother, Ruth, commented that the neighborhood reminded her of America decades ago. Everything seemed perfect. Until noon. A white envelope appeared taped neatly to their front door. David opened it casually. His smile disappeared almost instantly. The notice contained 5 separate violations. Improper placement of moving vehicle. Unauthorized flower containers. Temporary storage boxes visible from the street. Bicycle improperly stored. Failure to submit landscaping modification request. The family had lived there less than 24 hours. The total proposed fines already exceeded $600. David stared at the letter repeatedly. There had to be some mistake. Most neighborhoods welcomed new residents. Maple Ridge welcomed them with penalties. He remained calm. Surely a simple phone call would solve everything. Reasonable people made reasonable decisions. That assumption would soon become his greatest mistake. Later that afternoon, David walked to the clubhouse carrying the violation notice. Inside, everything reflected wealth and authority. Expensive leather chairs. Large frame certificates. Perfectly organized files. Margaret Collins sat behind an oversized wooden desk, reviewing documents with practiced confidence. She greeted him politely. Professionally. Almost warmly. Yet something about her smile never reached her eyes. David explained they had just moved in. He apologized if any temporary inconvenience had occurred. He politely requested a little understanding. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply pointed toward the neighborhood handbook. More than 400 pages. Every regulation. Every procedure. Every penalty. Every exception. Every loophole. She calmly explained that rules existed for everyone equally. Exceptions created chaos. Communities required discipline. Order demanded consistency. Everything sounded reasonable. Until David noticed framed photographs covering one office wall. Margaret standing beside board members. Neighborhood award ceremonies. Community celebrations. Then something else. Several board members' homes appeared in the photographs. One displayed oversized decorative statues, clearly violating height restrictions. Another featured elaborate landscaping impossible without approval. One driveway contained a recreational trailer forbidden by neighborhood regulations. None carried violation notices. David quietly understood something. The rules applied equally. Only on paper. Margaret ended the meeting by encouraging him to pay promptly to avoid additional late fees. She wished his family a pleasant stay. As David left the clubhouse, he noticed another resident arguing quietly with an HOA employee outside. An elderly widow clutched paperwork with trembling hands. Tears filled her eyes. Her mailbox had supposedly violated community standards. Replacing it would cost nearly an entire month's retirement income. Nobody offered help. People simply walked past. Looking away had become survival. David drove home, carrying far more than a violation notice. He carried doubt. For the first time since buying their dream home, he wondered whether they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Across the neighborhood, hidden behind polished appearances and perfectly maintained lawns, countless families watched the Parker house with silent anticipation. Some prayed the new family would stay quiet. Others secretly hoped they would fight. Because deep inside Maple Ridge Estates, beneath years of fear and corruption, the truth had been waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. And unknown to Margaret Collins, the first crack in her carefully built empire had already begun to form. The first week inside Maple Ridge Estates changed everything David Parker believed about neighborhoods, authority, and fairness. The violation notices did not stop after the first day. Instead, they multiplied with alarming precision. Every few mornings, another white envelope appeared on the front door. One notice claimed the family's recycling bin had remained visible for too long after collection day. Another insisted that the shade of mulch surrounding Emily's roses differed from the approved community standard. A third argued that Olivia's basketball hoop, placed in the driveway for less than an hour, created an unauthorized recreational obstruction. None of the violations seemed serious on their own. Together, they created an unmistakable message. The HOA wanted the Parker family to understand exactly who held power. David initially approached every notice with patience. He read the lengthy HOA handbook page by page, convinced he had overlooked important regulations. Every evening after work, he compared each citation against the written rules, highlighting sections, making notes, and organizing documents into neatly labeled folders. The more carefully he read, the more confused he became. Several violations referenced rules that did not exist. Others quoted sections that had nothing to do with the alleged offense. Some fines exceeded the maximum amounts described in the governing documents. The inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Emily noticed the growing stack of paperwork covering the dining room table. Their new home, once filled with excitement and plans for family dinners, slowly transformed into an unofficial investigation office. Instead of decorating rooms, they organized evidence. Instead of planning weekend barbecues, they reviewed violation dates. Instead of enjoying their dream home, they prepared for the next unexpected letter. Around them, the rest of Maple Ridge remained strangely quiet. Neighbors smiled politely while walking their dogs. They waved from their driveways. They complimented Emily's flowers. Yet every conversation ended just before becoming meaningful. Whenever David mentioned the HOA, smiles disappeared. Eyes shifted toward the clubhouse. Voices became softer. People suddenly remembered appointments, errands, or chores waiting at home. Fear had become part of everyday life. One afternoon, while trimming the front hedge exactly according to HOA measurements, David noticed Mr. Harold Bennett slowly approaching with a folded newspaper tucked beneath his arm. The elderly man looked around before stepping onto the Parker property. His cautious behavior spoke louder than any warning. He had spent years surviving under Margaret Collins' leadership. Old habits remained difficult to break. Without saying much, Harold handed David an old neighborhood newsletter from nearly 10 years earlier. The faded paper described Maple Ridge's annual community picnic, volunteer cleanup events, holiday decorating contests, and transparent financial meetings where residents openly voted on neighborhood improvements. The photographs looked almost unbelievable. Children laughed together. Families shared meals. Board members worked alongside residents instead of supervising them. The neighborhood had once functioned exactly as an HOA was supposed to. Harold quietly explained, through careful narration, that everything began changing after Margaret Collins became president. At first, the differences were subtle. Financial reports became shorter. Board meetings became less frequent. Committees disappeared. Independent volunteers stopped participating. Eventually, the same small group of people occupied nearly every important HOA position. Friends approved contracts for friends. Family members received landscaping jobs. Maintenance expenses doubled despite fewer visible improvements. Questioning these changes became increasingly dangerous. Residents who requested financial records often received unexpected compliance inspections. Those who ran against Margaret during elections mysteriously withdrew before voting day. Families who challenged board decisions found themselves overwhelmed with violations until moving away became the easiest solution. Harold himself had once questioned a large landscaping contract. Within 2 months, he accumulated more than 30 separate citations. Most were eventually dismissed. The stress remained. His wife spent her final years worrying about fines instead of enjoying retirement. After she passed away, Harold promised himself he would never challenge the board again. Until the Parker family arrived. Watching David continue asking reasonable questions reminded Harold of the neighborhood Maple Ridge used to be. It also reminded him how much had been stolen. That evening, David searched through the community's publicly available governing documents online. He expected transparency. Instead, he discovered missing records. Several years of financial statements had disappeared. Annual audit reports ended abruptly. Election results contained only final vote totals, without voter participation records. Vendor contracts listed company names, but omitted ownership information. The missing details raised more questions than answers. One contract immediately caught David's attention. The HOA had spent nearly $400,000 over 5 years on routine landscaping. Yet many common areas looked neglected. Flower beds contained weeds. Sprinkler systems leaked for weeks. Several sidewalks remained cracked despite repeated repair budgets. The numbers simply did not match reality. Curiosity slowly replaced frustration. David no longer believed he was dealing with strict management. He suspected something much larger. Meanwhile, Margaret Collins received regular updates from the HOA compliance office. She reviewed each report with practiced confidence. The Parkers remained polite. They paid only the uncontested fines. They continued requesting documentation. Most importantly, they kept asking questions. Questions had always been more dangerous than unpaid fees. Margaret instructed board members to increase routine inspections while maintaining an appearance of complete professionalism. Everything needed to look legal. Appearance mattered more than truth. Her greatest strength had always been plausible deniability. Across the neighborhood, quiet conversations slowly began spreading. Residents noticed David never raised his voice. He never insulted employees. He never ignored the rules. Instead, he documented everything. He photographed violations. He saved emails. He requested written explanations. He remained respectful, even while being treated unfairly. People began noticing something they had forgotten. Courage did not always look loud. Sometimes courage looked organized. A week later, Emily attended a community gardening workshop held at the clubhouse. Attendance had fallen dramatically over recent years, leaving only a handful of residents. Most conversations remained superficial, until one woman accidentally mentioned paying nearly $12,000 in HOA fines over 3 years. The room became silent. Another resident admitted quietly that her family refinanced their home after legal fees from HOA disputes. A retired teacher revealed she had stopped displaying patriotic decorations because every holiday resulted in new citations. Stories emerged carefully, not because people lacked experiences, because they lacked trust. Emily listened more than she spoke. By the end of the afternoon, she understood something heartbreaking. Almost every family carried their own version of the same story. Different violations, different years, different circumstances, identical patterns. Fear had isolated everyone. Isolation protected corruption. That realization became the first step toward changing everything. Several days later, Olivia volunteered at the neighborhood library inside the clubhouse. While organizing donated books in a storage room, she noticed several dusty filing boxes stacked behind unused furniture. One partially open box revealed outdated HOA newsletters, meeting agendas, and financial summaries from years earlier. Most people would have ignored them. Olivia remembered her father's growing collection of missing records. She quietly noted the labels before leaving. That evening, she mentioned the forgotten boxes. David's curiosity immediately returned. If old records still existed somewhere inside the clubhouse, perhaps the missing pieces of Maple Ridge's history had never disappeared. Perhaps someone had simply hidden them. Days later, another unexpected opportunity arrived. The HOA announced a volunteer archive project, asking residents to help digitize old community documents before an upcoming anniversary celebration. Very few people volunteered. David submitted his name immediately. Margaret approved the request without hesitation. She believed she understood exactly who David Parker was. A polite homeowner, an optimistic newcomer, an amateur asking inconvenient questions. She believed she remained several moves ahead. What she failed to realize was that confidence often blinded people to the dangers already standing inside their own walls. The following Saturday morning, David entered the clubhouse archive room carrying nothing more than a notebook, a scanner, and genuine curiosity. Dust covered dozens of forgotten storage boxes. Years of paperwork waited untouched. Meeting minutes, vendor invoices, election notices, maintenance records. Most appeared ordinary, until one faded folder slipped from the bottom of an aging cabinet. Its label had nearly disappeared. Only 3 handwritten words remained visible. Confidential board correspondence. David slowly opened the folder. Inside rested documents no resident had ever been intended to see. And before the morning ended, he would discover the first undeniable proof that Maple Ridge's corruption had never been accidental. It had been carefully planned. David Parker stared at the worn folder for several long moments before touching the first document. Years of dust coated its edges, but the papers inside had been carefully preserved. Someone had wanted these records hidden, not destroyed. That distinction immediately caught David's attention. Destroying evidence would have been risky. Hiding it where no one would think to look was far safer. He carefully began scanning each page. At first, the contents appeared routine. Old meeting schedules, maintenance proposals, vendor estimates, committee recommendations. Then the pattern slowly emerged. Several contracts approved by the HOA board had been awarded to companies with unfamiliar names. On paper, each business appeared independent, but attached correspondence revealed something completely different. Different company names, the same mailing address, different contractors, The same bank account listed for payments. Different landscaping businesses. The same contact phone number. David's heartbeat quickened. This was no accounting mistake. The HOA had been approving contracts between itself and companies secretly connected to members of the board. Millions of dollars had not disappeared overnight. They had quietly flowed through years of carefully disguised transactions. He continued scanning every page, refusing to rush. One document stood out above all the others. It was an internal memo written nearly 8 years earlier. The language remained professional, but its meaning was unmistakable. The memo recommended increasing enforcement activity after major budget shortfalls because violation revenue provides a dependable supplemental income source. Violation revenue. Not community safety. Not neighborhood improvement. Income. Residents had never been treated as neighbors. They had become financial assets. David photographed every page before returning each document exactly where he found it. Nothing could appear disturbed. If Margaret realized someone had discovered the archive, the evidence might disappear forever. He left the clubhouse carrying only digital copies and a growing understanding that Maple Ridge's problems extended far beyond unfair fines. This was organized corruption. That evening, the Parker dining table filled with documents once again. Emily reviewed financial statements, while David compared payment records against public business registrations. Olivia searched county databases. Grandmother Ruth organized timelines using handwritten notes across large sheets of paper. What had begun as one family's struggle had quietly transformed into a full investigation. Hours passed. Connections multiplied. One landscaping company belonged to Margaret's brother-in-law. A maintenance contractor had been managed by the son of another board member. A legal consulting firm handling HOA collections employed the nephew of the association's treasurer. Every contract pointed back toward the same small circle. Competition had become an illusion. Board approval had become a family business. The next surprise came from Harold Bennett. Late one afternoon, he arrived carrying 2 heavy storage boxes that had remained untouched inside his garage for over a decade. His wife had carefully saved neighborhood newsletters, annual budgets, election notices, and handwritten meeting notes from the years before Margaret took control. Harold had never thrown them away. Something had always told him they might matter someday. Now they finally did. Together, the documents created a timeline impossible to ignore. Before Margaret's presidency, annual maintenance expenses remained stable despite neighborhood expansion. After her election, spending nearly tripled within 4 years. Meanwhile, visible maintenance steadily declined. Trees went untrimmed. Playgrounds deteriorated. Streetlights remained broken for months. Residents paid more while receiving less. Money had vanished somewhere between collection and completion. Emily noticed another disturbing pattern. Every family forced to sell their home after prolonged HOA disputes had lived on streets later targeted for expensive redevelopment projects. Once those homes entered foreclosure or sold below market value, investors connected to board members purchased several properties through limited liability companies. The cycle repeated itself again and again. Pressure, fines, financial exhaustion, forced sale, cheap purchase, profitable resale. Corruption had expanded beyond HOA management. It had become a business model. Meanwhile, Margaret Collins remained unusually confident. The Parker family still appeared calm. No lawsuits. No television reporters. No social media campaigns. Only paperwork. She had defeated paperwork before. She assumed history would repeat itself. At the monthly HOA board meeting, Margaret proudly announced another successful financial quarter. Attendance remained low as usual. Most residents no longer believed meetings changed anything. Those who attended often left discouraged. That evening, however, several unfamiliar faces quietly entered the clubhouse. Former residents, people who had moved away years earlier, families whose names Harold had mentioned. Word had slowly spread through phone calls, emails, and neighborhood friendships that someone inside Maple Ridge was finally asking the questions everyone else had abandoned. The room looked different. Not crowded. Curious. Margaret noticed the change immediately. She continued speaking confidently. Budget updates, maintenance reports, community improvements, routine announcements. Then came the portion reserved for resident comments. For years, this section lasted only a few minutes. Nobody wanted retaliation. David calmly approached the microphone carrying a neatly organized binder. He requested clarification regarding several landscaping contracts approved over previous years. Margaret answered generally. David presented payment summaries. She responded with procedural explanations. He introduced publicly available business registrations showing shared addresses between multiple vendors. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Margaret maintained her composure. She insisted similarities proved nothing. David agreed. By themselves, they proved very little. Then he displayed additional records. Tax filings, corporate registrations, board approval dates, vendor ownership histories. Every document came from public records. Every connection could be independently verified. Residents exchanged nervous glances. For the first time in years, questions replaced silence. Board members shifted uncomfortably. Several avoided eye contact altogether. Margaret attempted to move the meeting forward, claiming the discussion exceeded time limits. David calmly reminded everyone that financial transparency formed one of the HOA's legal responsibilities. The room grew quieter than ever. No shouting. No accusations. Only facts. Facts often frightened dishonest people more than anger ever could. Following the meeting, whispers spread through Maple Ridge faster than any official announcement. Neighbors who had ignored one another for years began comparing violation notices. Old filing cabinets reopened. Boxes stored in attics came downstairs. Retired accountants examined financial reports. Former committee volunteers searched personal records. One family still possessed canceled checks from special assessment fees collected years earlier. Another retained photographs proving expensive maintenance projects had never been completed despite recorded payments. Evidence multiplied because people finally believed someone would listen. Fear slowly lost its grip. Courage proved surprisingly contagious. Within 2 weeks, nearly 40 families joined together. No longer isolated. No longer ashamed. No longer convinced they stood alone. Together, they created a resident oversight committee completely independent of the HOA board. Retired auditors volunteered financial expertise. Former attorneys reviewed governing documents. Technology professionals organized thousands of scanned records into searchable databases. Everything remained legal. Everything remained transparent. Everything remained documented. Margaret watched the growing movement with increasing concern. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she faced organized residents instead of isolated homeowners. Her usual strategies became less effective. Issuing violations to 40 families simultaneously would appear suspicious. Targeting David alone no longer solved the problem. Too many people now understood the pattern. Desperation slowly replaced confidence. Several board members privately discussed resigning before matters worsened. Others insisted remaining united. Margaret chose a different path. She authorized the HOA attorney to file legal action against David Parker, accusing him of obtaining confidential documents improperly and damaging the association's reputation through false allegations. The lawsuit arrived at the Parker home 3 days later. Its size alone intimidated many people. Hundreds of pages. Legal terminology. Demand letters. Threats of significant financial damages. The goal was obvious. Not victory. Fear. Margaret believed overwhelming David with legal expenses would discourage everyone else. She underestimated something important. The evidence no longer belonged to one family. Copies existed everywhere. Multiple attorneys had already reviewed the documents. Former residents possessed matching records. Public databases confirmed ownership connections. The truth had become impossible to erase. As news of the lawsuit spread, something remarkable happened. Instead of retreating, more residents stepped forward. Families who had remained silent for years suddenly volunteered their own experiences. Anonymous letters became signed affidavits. Hidden documents became public evidence. Fear finally met something stronger. Unity. Late one evening, David received a phone call from someone who refused to identify themselves. The voice remained calm. Brief. Almost hurried. Only one message mattered. The county's Office of Community Oversight had officially opened a preliminary investigation into Maple Ridge Estates after receiving multiple independent complaints supported by extensive documentation. The caller ended the conversation immediately. David quietly placed the phone on the table. No celebration followed. No excitement. Only silent relief. For the first time since moving into Maple Ridge, justice no longer depended solely on brave homeowners. Now, people with legal authority were beginning to ask the same questions. And Margaret Collins had no idea that investigators were already preparing to examine every financial record she had spent years trying to keep hidden. The news of the county investigation spread through Maple Ridge Estates more quietly than any neighborhood rumor before it. There were no dramatic announcements. No flashing news cameras. No officials arriving with sirens. Instead, there was something Margaret Collins feared far more than public spectacle. There was silence. A different kind of silence. For years, silence had protected corruption because residents were too frightened to speak. Now silence carried anticipation. Everyone was waiting. Every homeowner knew something had changed. The county investigators worked methodically. They requested financial ledgers dating back more than a decade. Vendor contracts, election records, insurance policies, meeting minutes, bank statements, expense reports. Unlike ordinary homeowners, they had legal authority to demand documents that Margaret had spent years keeping beyond public reach. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she could not decide which records people were allowed to see. The investigation had moved beyond her control. Within days, cracks began appearing inside the board itself. Members who had stood beside Margaret for years suddenly became difficult to reach. Phone calls went unanswered. Emergency meetings were postponed. Excuses replaced confidence. People who once defended every decision now quietly hired their own attorneys. Loyalty built on personal gain rarely survived real accountability. As investigators compared contracts with corporate ownership records, the pattern became impossible to deny. Companies receiving the HOA's largest contracts were directly connected to board members and their relatives. Several businesses existed only on paper. Others charged prices dramatically higher than market value while delivering little or no documented work. Money collected from hardworking homeowners had quietly circulated through an interconnected network of private interests. What residents had suspected for years was now supported by evidence. Meanwhile, David Parker refused to celebrate prematurely. He reminded everyone involved in the Resident Oversight Committee that facts, not emotions, had carried them this far. Every document remained carefully organized. Every statement remained truthful. Every accusation continued to rely on verifiable evidence rather than assumptions. That discipline became their greatest strength. The lawsuit Margaret had filed against David quickly began falling apart. During preliminary court proceedings, her attorneys struggled to explain why the supposedly confidential documents matched public financial records obtained independently by multiple residents. The judge questioned the basis of several claims. Discovery requests expanded. Instead of putting David on the defensive, the lawsuit opened even more financial records for examination. Margaret's own legal strategy had become another doorway to the truth. Outside the courtroom, Maple Ridge was changing in ways no one had expected. Neighbors who had spent years avoiding one another started talking again. Families gathered in driveways during evenings. Children returned to neighborhood sidewalks. The basketball hoop that once generated violation notices became the center of weekend games. People who had hidden behind closed curtains now greeted each other openly. Fear had divided them. Truth was slowly bringing them back together. Emily organized informal neighborhood gatherings where residents discussed ideas for improving the community once the investigation concluded. For the first time in years, conversations centered on hope rather than penalties. People spoke about restoring playgrounds, creating community gardens, hosting holiday festivals, supporting elderly homeowners instead of threatening them with fines. Maple Ridge slowly remembered what a neighborhood was supposed to feel like. Not every resident had been directly harmed by the HOA. Some had benefited from favorable treatment. Others had simply stayed quiet to protect their families. Yet even many of them admitted they had known something was wrong. Looking away had seemed easier than speaking up. Now they understood that silence carried its own cost. Weeks later, the county released its preliminary findings. The report was extensive. It documented conflicts of interest, improper contract approvals, serious failures in financial oversight, election procedures that violated governing requirements, selective enforcement of community rules, unauthorized fee increases, record-keeping deficiencies stretching back nearly a decade. Investigators recommended immediate corrective action and referred portions of the case to additional state authorities for further review. Margaret Collins resigned before the final report became public. So did 3 other board members. Their resignations contained carefully written statements denying intentional wrongdoing while claiming they wished to allow the community to move forward. Few residents accepted those explanations. Actions had spoken louder than resignation letters ever could. Several civil lawsuits followed. Homeowners who had paid unlawful fines sought reimbursement. Former residents challenged questionable foreclosure-related practices. Insurance companies reviewed prior claims. Financial institutions reopened lending files connected to suspicious property transfers. Justice did not arrive overnight. It arrived piece by piece, methodically, legally, permanently. Months later, a court approved a settlement requiring substantial financial restitution to affected homeowners. Thousands of dollars in improper fines were refunded. Special assessments collected without proper authorization were partially reimbursed. Independent financial oversight became mandatory. Future contracts required competitive bidding with full public disclosure. Every board meeting would now be recorded and made available to residents. Election procedures were rewritten to ensure transparency. Most importantly, homeowners regained access to the records that had always belonged to them. The neighborhood elected an entirely new HOA board. This time, candidates campaigned openly. Residents asked difficult questions. Financial backgrounds were reviewed. Committees included volunteers from different streets, rather than close friends of board members. Power became shared instead of concentrated. Harold Bennett attended the first meeting under the new leadership. He quietly sat in the back of the room, watching younger families raise ideas without fear. Children laughed outside the clubhouse windows, while parents debated landscaping budgets respectfully. Nobody received threats. Nobody was silenced. When the meeting ended, Harold remained seated for several extra minutes. The atmosphere reminded him of Maple Ridge from decades earlier. Not perfect, but honest. That difference meant everything. Olivia eventually started a neighborhood youth volunteer program that paired teenagers with elderly residents needing help with yard work, groceries, and home maintenance. Instead of issuing violation notices over overgrown lawns, neighbors simply helped one another. Emily transformed the neglected community garden into a place where families planted flowers together every spring. The garden became more than landscaping. It became a reminder that communities flourish through cooperation, not control. David declined repeated requests to run for HOA president. Many residents believed no one deserved the position more. He politely refused. His goal had never been power. It had always been accountability. Instead, he accepted a volunteer role leading the community's Financial Transparency Committee, where every resident could examine budgets, contracts, and expenditures whenever they wished. Trust, he believed, should never depend on blind faith. It should depend on open records. Nearly a year after moving into Maple Ridge, David walked through the neighborhood one quiet evening. The same entrance sign still welcomed visitors. The same oak trees lined the streets. The same homes reflected the setting sun. Everything looked familiar. Yet everything had changed. The beauty no longer hid fear. It reflected peace. As he passed the clubhouse, a new plaque near the entrance caught his attention. It had been installed by the residents themselves. Its inscription was simple. A strong community is not built by perfect rules. It is built by honest people who protect one another. Visitors admired the flowers. Children admired the playground. Homeowners admired their neighborhood. Few outsiders would ever know how close Maple Ridge had come to losing everything. But the people who lived there never forgot. They learned that corruption rarely begins with enormous crimes. It begins with small compromises that everyone hopes someone else will challenge. They learned that silence protects injustice far longer than dishonesty ever could. Most importantly, they discovered that ordinary people, standing together with patience, evidence, and integrity, can accomplish something even the most powerful individuals fear. They can make the truth impossible to hide. And in Maple Ridge Estates, where fear had once ruled every perfectly trimmed lawn, justice finally became the strongest foundation of all.